Thank you, Telba. I'd like to now request that the most recent speakers come back up for a panel discussion. So Bennett, Brett, Telba, I know I forgot somebody. Diana, thank you, and Ross. Well, they're getting settled in. I will start off with a few questions, but also encourage the audience to ask questions as well. A lot of information, and first I applaud everybody for staying on schedule. When I saw how many slides we had today, I thought this was going to be quite a task, but you all were very disciplined. One item that was not discussed in detail that I thought might be interesting to discuss for just a minute with the panel is preferences have been part of marketing research, if you will, that industry has used for a long time. I want to discuss the difference between preferences in the context of clinical trials and how preferences are used in marketing research, if you will.
All right. You want to go first? Well, I'll give you some thoughts. Preference studies, conjoints, for example, have been done all the time in commercial and marketing work. And initially, I looked at some of the work. I find that the insights there do not lend themselves always to working in a clinical context. There's a lot of information that are used in commercial applications that are very important in outlining your basic trends of where you want to direct the development of a device or a drug, but it does not necessarily lend itself as well to an application to a clinical trial, because the clinical trial definitions of endpoints are very precise and very harsh, and the definitions used in more qualitative applications, even if the method is quantitative, are not necessarily aligned, a little bit fluffier. That's where I would start.
Yeah, I would comment on that as well. You know, from a small company perspective, which is where I sit, much of the market research we do fundamentally is qualitative, and as we've talked earlier, qualitative information is helpful, particularly in identifying issues, but it doesn't help sort of quantitate how patients trade things off. When we do quantitative research, as Bennett sort of implied in his comments, it's often focused on understanding either the attributes of the product and how they're perceived, but not on really thinking about how the patient makes that trade-off decision. And so it's valuable information. A lot of the techniques overlap and are used, but it's more sort of how you use them, what the focus is. Mm-hmm. Clearly, in sort of regulatory purposes, you really want to understand how patients react to the technology, think about the benefits and risks, as opposed to thinking about how you adjust the features and benefits to fit what the patients want. It's a different perspective that is used in the approaches.
A slightly different way to think about it is a lot of the methods, the quantitative methods in particular, in market research are geared at predicting. You know, so in essence, if you're thinking that we're trying to explain the choices that people are making, we're concerned about the right-hand side of the equation here. What are the trade-offs that people are making, and what are the weights that they put on different things? Most market research is really focused on the left-hand side. How do we tweak the stuff on the right-hand side to get a more precise estimate of what's going on the left-hand side, so we can talk about things like market share? So in essence, even in cases where there are similar methods, the focus is a little bit different, because what we really want to know is what are the trade-offs people are willing to make, similar to what Ross said, whereas in a lot of market research applications, one of the key motives is to predict, and they're not necessarily the same thing.
Another question. Telba, you mentioned in your presentation that preference information can be used to inform the clinical trial design. I know that there was a lot of research that FDA did around obesity. Do you have an example where you could talk about how preference information may have been used in a clinical trial design, and how we might want to think about that as sponsors come forward in the future?
Yes, actually I'm going to be more specific about that in the next presentation, but just to give an idea, with the obesity survey, we could calculate for each particular type of risk and other characteristics, attributes of device, what would be the minimum or the expected benefit by a patient. And actually, because we acknowledge patients are heterogeneous, and because of the methodology we could use, we could see that for an average patient, for a risk-tolerant patient, and for a risk-averse patient. So we could compute the maximum acceptable risk for a certain benefit and a minimal desirable benefit for a certain risk. So if a company comes with a device for which we expect certain risks, certain diet restrictions, and certain other inconveniences of the device, we could determine what would be the minimal clinically meaningful benefit for that particular device. We could use that to design our trial.
Thank you.
Can I comment on that, Bill?
Absolutely.
So in my day job, I look at hundreds of business plans for companies, and it's very interesting because there are probably 40 or 50 obesity companies been formed over the last decade, and we've seen many of them in our opportunity to evaluate them. And what I've seen since the publication of the obesity report is that they're all coming in talking about how they've thought about their clinical trial design relative to the study. And this is, I'm seeing it from the outside looking in, but it's very interesting how that study has really informed early stage thinking about, okay, I've got to get this product developed and I know I have to get it approved. Here's what I'm going to have to show. And it's really, I think, helped in an area where many of us had concerns about how you prove the value of these technologies before that study was done. So I've actually seen the benefits of it, of that study, manifesting itself in business plans that I'm seeing from startups in and around obesity.
Just a brief anecdote. A colleague of mine, Jamie Cross, was working on a rare disease, Fragile X syndrome, and they had absolutely no idea what were the right efficacy endpoints. So they did a preference study with patients, and they actually used the results of that to decide which endpoints would be going into the clinical trials.
Thank you. There's a question up front. If you'll hold on just for a minute so we can get a microphone.
Can I just make one other comment?
Sure, Ross.
In the report itself, by the way, and I should have noted this in my comments, but at the end of many of the sections, we actually take the example of the obesity report and use it to discuss how the concepts discussed in the section might apply. So you'll see at the end of each section, at least in sections 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, a one-page vignette about applying the concept from the section to the obesity area and the obesity study. So we just wanted to highlight that as being part of the report.
Thanks. John?
I'm John Bridges from Johns Hopkins. I'm a patient preference researcher. I want to congratulate the group and the FDA. This is a really monumental day for us who have been doing patient preference research for the last couple of decades. We never thought that this day would come, that actually anyone would pay attention to our research. Yeah. So thanks very much for that. In addition to this notion of preference-sensitive care and the benefit-risk framework, I think that there are two other justifications for why patient preference data is important. As an academic and at a major medical institution, it's good science. It's something that's measurable, and we've got good, very scientific methods to measure it. The absence of this information leaves us, with one arm tied behind our back. So that's one justification. The other justification, and that I do a lot of work with patient groups, is really about a principle of justice. This offers now a larger group of people to get involved in this, and on the principle of justice. So, I think we can cast that net broader than just preference-sensitive decisions, and even on the scientific grounds, that maybe we could even cast the net a little bit further and say that based on those principles, good science and justice, that really one day preference information will become ubiquitous with the whole evidence-based medicine, good scientific approaches. So.
Thank you, John. Appreciate the feedback, and we appreciate the support. Diana, I have a question for you. So you've been a part of the steering committee from the beginning. You're very involved in regulatory aspects within a large medical device company. So tomorrow you go back to your company, you go back to Medtronic, and we have this report that has been released. How do you communicate this to your colleagues? You know, there's going to be questions around how should it be used, when's the best time to incorporate patient preferences into studies. And so let's talk about the practical implementation of this work and how it disseminates, in this case, for your organization.
Well, I mean, first of all, I would say to closer. That it's fair. The information will be fairly overwhelming, I think, for industry. I mean, I'm from a large company, so we have a lot more people who have expertise in these areas. But for a smaller company, there's a lot of information to digest. So there's a lot of education that needs to be done. I think that people will need to see and maybe even work through some case studies in some ways of, you know, when might this be applicable? How would you do it? I think that might help industry. But I think we have a lot of education to do. I think what we do understand within industry is we understand, you know, how to identify the attributes that are important to patients. We have to do that as part of designing products and our design input. We understand that part. What we don't understand as well, probably across the industry, is how to weight attributes and how to make the trade-offs and to do that type of quantitative work. So we'll need to go back and start to work with other functions like the research and development functions or the clinical functions, you know, to try and, you know, disseminate it across the organization. But it's not a small task.
Thank you. A question from Brian Luce.
Good morning. This is really fun to listen to. I'm Brian Luce from Pecori, and we'll be talking a little bit this afternoon. And so one of the things I'll probably bring up this afternoon has to do with the fact that Pecori works post-market, in essence. I mean, funds research and comparative effectiveness research in the real world. And the question I have is the patient preference information we're talking about now is developed within what I would call the efficacy world of developing evidence within the clinical trials for regulatory decision making, and I'm wondering the degree to which you have any sense of that evidence being applicable to real world decision making, where there's a lot more things in the mix in terms of how devices are used within the procedures and the nature of healthcare. That is, of course, a lot more noise in the system. Yeah.
Well, thanks for that, Brian, and by the way, thanks for your involvement in the project as well. So we appreciate that. Section 7 of the report touches on these issues, and we just didn't have the bandwidth, I think, or actually the right expertise around the table to really focus on sort of the non-regulatory application of this information. And as I said, in order to get the project done, we really kept those regulatory blinders on. But let me comment on a couple areas that we've thought a little bit about. Certainly, an area that I focus on a lot these days, because I think it's now, more than FDA, the major barrier to innovation in this country is reimbursement. And to date, reimbursement decisions are based purely on clinical outcomes evidence. They really don't coverage decisions don't factor in what patients might actually want. And the insurance companies, be it CMS on the public side, Medicare on the public side, Medicare on the public side, or the private insurers don't even ask really what patients want. We often get patients lobbying for something with the insurance companies, but I think there's going to be a big role to take information on patient preferences to the insurance companies and say, look, your customers, as it were, are these patients. Here's what they want in terms of technology, and here's the subpopulation that would want that. And I think this information will be helpful. How it's going to be used in that section, I don't think we've really thought about. But until we have the information, it's hard to figure out how to use it. So what I'm hopeful is that the information developed for regulatory purposes will be very applicable to that next barrier to innovation, which is reimbursement. The other area, clearly this information is already used in marketing and used in a different way in marketing, so it will have value, I think, in really thinking about how we position products, particularly as the medical device industry and the health insurance system, I mean, the healthcare delivery system in general, are going through a different way of transformation in how they think about buying products now. So we don't sell to the individual doctor, we sell to institutions. We have to sell more based on data than we do features and benefits. And as part of that, having patient preference information to go to an institution and say, look, here's something your patients are going to value, I think will be extremely valuable. The third area that I have a particular personal interest in is this area of shared medical decision-making. And particularly as we shift from a fee-for-service system towards an integrated delivery system. And I think the provider organizations, particularly those at risk for managing populations, are going to be very interested in making sure that the patients getting a service are those that truly want it and understand the risks and benefits and are involved in shared medical decision-making. And I think this information we develop on patient preferences will assist in the development of the appropriate materials to inform patients of the benefits and risks, and then also help them make really good decisions about their care. And so, again, this whole field is a nascent area. I mean, John and his colleagues have been doing work in it for a while, but they've been a little bit, sort of on the cutting edge of this. And there's a lot to learn in how we use this information, but we'll never be able to figure out how to use it until we have it. And so the initial driver, if the initial driver is regulatory, great, let's get it, and then let's see if we can encourage the development and use in other areas.
And if I could just add from an MDIC perspective, the question around further research, the post-market area we believe is an area that's also ripe for work to carry this work forward. And so as we start to develop our future plans, we'll want to work closely with groups like PCORI to see how we might take this construct that we've developed and evolve it into that post-market space, because it is for a real deployment. We call it post-market, but it's really post-approval. The marketing only happens when you can get it paid for and you can actually get it out to patients. There's a question there.
Can I just quickly, just to add on for Brian's comment, there is a literature out there really on health services delivery and health services systems that kind of gets into the real world type stuff, and the stuff that is specific on preferences for drugs and devices and those types of things hasn't kind of gotten into that space yet, I hope. But another, back to the shared decision-making point, I actually just reviewed a paper on the plane yesterday where the authors had looked at preferences in an area where there were multiple treatments and really began to say, okay, how can we segment this population into those for whom one treatment may be better because it is preferred than another? So what we're seeing is you're beginning to see this stuff get into the real-world applications as opposed to, do the benefits outweigh the risks? Do I prefer product A over product B? You're starting to see that happen, and that's an evolution that I think the health services folks are a little bit ahead in, but this seems to be moving in that direction.
And just quickly, Bennett.
Yes, even without reimbursement or considerations, just the fact that clinical trials only look at a few hundred to a couple of thousand patients means that post-approval, you're going to discover new side effects. The side effects that you know about may change in frequency, or due to practice patterns, their severity may go up or go down. All of those entail reconsidering the very same study. Forget totally about any reimbursement or shared decision-making questions. Just the very fact that you're in the real world changes the kind of inputs that would go into understanding preferences.
Michelle McKellar, Boston Medical Associates. This question's for Telba. I'm wondering if in the clinical trial design discussions that you had any discussions about use of the risk-benefit tolerance for patients in an adaptive design type of scenario, and whether there's opportunity there for looking at, a different adaptive design approach that really looks at risks relative to patient tolerance of risks. I guess there's always opportunities for adaptive designs. I'm a big advocate for adaptive designs, and you could conceive complicated adaptive designs, and you could even adapt the design based on previous experiences that patients had in the first group of patients. We haven't studied that in depth, but I can conceive situations in which this could happen. Another idea is what we have talked before about the post-market situation in which we could have preferences in pre-market and then continue to collect patients in post-market and see how they change and how, our assessment of this risk-benefit for that particular technology might change.
Another question I have here is there's kind of two spectrums that can come out from a criticism perspective from industry, and we've touched on this a little bit. Well, this is going to become an additional requirement. It's going to complicate the studies, it's going to make them more costly and less predictable. And then on the other side is this is going to allow for products with a higher risk profile to get to patients that maybe don't necessarily benefit or view the benefit that outweighs the risks. Anybody from the panel want to touch on those two?
I'll just start with the industry perspective. Industry in good part is doing studies.
Move the mic.
Industry in good part is doing studies like this, and many times we're looking for an avenue to present them in a regulatory context. And in the past, it's been uncertain who would look at it in a regulatory agency. This is an avenue for taking that data and using it to inform a regulatory decision. So we're doing this stuff. In other cases, a company has not been doing it, but they've asked similar questions. How much benefit is benefit enough? How much risk is too much? And there have been various techniques to handle it, but this now provides something that companies would welcome. Compared to the cost of many clinical trials, a preference study is not terribly expensive.
Let me give it a sort of different perspective on that, Bill, if I could. I'm sorry.
Sure.
As well, because I think the biggest burden on this would be on a small company who's got a new single product they're trying to develop, and where these studies might cost them extra hundreds of thousands of dollars to do. I think one of the biggest challenges that we've had historically with FDA is getting staff and at the FDA and companies talking about this, not arguing with each other about what's the important benefit and risk, but trying to get them on the same page. And those debates, when they happen, cause time. And the biggest cost to our companies is really time, because the indirect costs of the monthly burn rate, really add up. So if it takes an extra 3 months to come to a decision for a company that's spending $500,000 a month, that 3-month delay as we talk about these issues costs that company an incremental $1.5 million. And so if they can spend a couple $100,000 on doing a patient preference study that shortens that discussion, that makes the conversation better with the FDA, it's well worth it. And there's some real economics that could be involved here in helping it. At one level, it's just the right thing to do, to have the right basis for the decision. But I also view it as a tool to facilitate discussion where all of a sudden you can talk about what the important benefits and risks are based on shared information about how the patients view those issues. And I hope that will improve the quality of those discussions. And as an investor, I hope it will shorten the time for those discussions so that we can advance the ball more quickly with our companies.
I want to give a chance for the question over here.
Hi. So I'm Teresa Mullen. I work in the Center for Drugs at FDA. And I think when I heard about one of the likely places where you'd want to use the patient preference elicitation approach and add that is preference-sensitive decisions, and I think I heard that those are the ones that for which the benefits and risks, the benefits do not clearly outweigh the risks. That it's not as what we would call in CEDAR a slam dunk. Where the drug is just fabulous, and where it's maybe a little less certain. There's a little bit of it's a closer call. And also, I heard from a couple of speakers, I think Bennett and Telba, that it's one where there's considerable uncertainty. There's a lot of unknown. And so those are really challenging factors to build into an elicitation. In our work with talking to patients, and patients who are, let's just say, not naive, they're very experienced, they've been through the mill, if you will, in terms of treatment with their disease. They're very conscious of how complex, especially when you're ill and emotionally overwhelmed by the prospect of dying and everything else, that makes it even more of a difficult cognitive task. So one question is, how do you really capture that uncertainty around the central value, the expected benefit or the expected harm? The person may not have the expected value. They often think they're going to do better. They usually are like, I'll do better than the average. But how do you effectively convey that? And the other question I have is, how would we manage if, the FDA, the party that's going to do this elicitation, it sounds like, has a vested interest in the outcome of the preferences, and there's a literature on how to frame decisions, and the way you frame it as gains or losses and so on can affect the results that you get. So how do you work against that potential motivational bias that in structuring the elicitation for the patients?
Uncertainty probably is the biggest challenge that I've encountered. In the work that we have done, you can talk about, expectations. What's the probability of this? What's the probability of that? Getting around uncertainty is difficult, not only because it's a tough concept, but also because people tend to put themselves at one end of the distribution versus the other. So that's probably one of the biggest challenges we have. I don't think that invalidates the evidence that we have. I think it's a consideration in interpreting the evidence that we have. And that's going to vary from patient group to patient group, depending on the nature of the uncertainty. And as Bennett pointed out, and is pointed out in the framework, part of your decision about what to do is how uncertain the benefits and the outcomes are, or the benefits and the harms are, because you're working to apply this to an evidence base, essentially, and try to, as another piece of evidence, to put all the pieces together. So I think that's an area for future research. I think that's a tough question. We've tried to do some stuff and run into just challenges in doing that. I think with regard to the framing question, though, there is a literature out there, and there are different standards that you can use for how do you frame this thing. And one of the standards that makes intuitive sense to me is that you frame it in such a way that it mimics the real life decision. How would it be framed? And that's where the consultation from physicians and patients and others, how do they make the decision becomes the first question, and then frame it accordingly. And then to the third point with regard to potential bias, because you could manipulate these things. I think what we're seeing here is first, there's a long track record of these studies done by different types of people. And in this particular case, they're industry-sponsored studies, and they need to stand up to scrutiny. So, and I don't think the industry would have an incentive to try and rig something, because they're going to want it published in peer review. Plus, as expertise grows within in FDA and other organizations and patient organizations, they're going to be able to criticize that study. But also, we are seeing already in this room, there are industry-sponsored studies. FDA sponsored their weight loss study, so it's not just coming from industry. John's done a lot of work with patient groups, particularly the Duchenne group. So each one of those groups, in essence, has their own agenda, but each one of those groups is accountable to the others as well. And John's study wouldn't have had the impact that it did, or the obesity study wouldn't have had the impact that it did if there were questions about the validity of that study.
Excellent. Go ahead.
Can I just add that that's very helpful? I was thinking that these studies would be part of a pre-market submission and therefore confidential. So it's helpful to know that they'll be public.
Well, yeah, they may or they may not be, and that's probably something where the standards don't exist. Eventually these things see the light of day. The question is when, but I think if that's the goal and the expectation, then that helps in that pre-market space.
And let me add a little bit from my perspective, all these points that you are raising are very valid, but they are, in my opinion, analogous or the points that we see on clinical trials that are basically sponsored by the sponsors that are the interested part in the approval of the product. So the FDA goes with due diligence, try to scrutinize these studies for biases, for good clinical practices. So we are going to have to go through the same process with this kind of evidence. Everything is analogous. We have uncertainty on the benefits, on the risks. They come with a lot of uncertainty. The preferences will come with uncertainty as well, coming from the framing of the questions on who is the population that's being consulted, and etc. So we are going to embark in a new era in which we are not only going to scrutinize the clinical studies, but also the preference studies in the same way.